Good evening, everyone. My name is Regina Williams, and today is Thursday, March 3rd, 2022. Welcome to this presentation in the inaugural series, the By the Book Author discussion series of the Western Reserve Historical Society. We're honored this evening to have as our guest presenter, Dr. Cassi Pittman Claytor. And before I introduce her, I just want to go through a few housekeeping details. First, we'd like to ask everyone to please mute the microphone during her presentation for the 1 hour that we've scheduled together this evening. We'd like for her to have at least 30 to 40 minutes to go through her slide presentation and save at least 15 to 20 minutes at the end of the hour for Q&A with the audience. And if we can do that, I think we'll have a wonderful video that we can share beyond this evening's presentation and get other people interested in her book and interested in this topic associated with Black privilege. And without any further preliminaries, I'd like to read to you the biographical sketch for Dr. Cassi Pittman Claytor. Cassi Pittman Claytor is the Climo Junior Professor of Sociology at Case Western Reserve University and the acting co-director of the African and African American Studies minor. Her research focuses on how racial minorities, particularly Blacks, manage contemporary forms of racism. In Pittman Claytor's new book, Black Privilege, Modern Middle-Class Blacks with Credentials and Cash to Spend, from Stanford University Press, she enriches our understanding of the Black middle class, focusing particularly on their economic reality and experiences as consumers. She has investigated Blacks' experiences shopping while Black in retail settings, as well as their experiences of discrimination in the mortgage market. In 2019, Sephora brought Pittman Claytor on board in their effort to systematically study the problem of retail racism. She served as a research lead, designing and assisting in the orchestration of a first of its kind national study of racial bias and exclusionary treatment in retail settings. In recognition of her work, Pittman Claytor was just named as one of 100 people transforming business by Business Insider. While an assistant professor at Case Western Reserve University, she has been awarded the Woodrow Wilson Foundation's Early Career Enhancement Fellowship and the Hutchins Center for African and African American Research's Sheila Biddle Ford Foundation Fellowship at Harvard University. Pittman Claytor received her BA from the University of Pennsylvania and her PhD from Harvard University. Thank you, Dr. Cassi Pittman Claytor, for joining us this evening. I'll keep my eye on the waiting room and mute my microphone so that I am able to focus on what you're saying and also focus on inviting our guests to join the discussion.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Dr. Williams, for that kind introduction and also for thinking of me and inviting me to join today and be a part of the By the Book series. I guess one thing that was not in my bio is that I'm a native Clevelander and I'm a current resident of Glenville. And so I walk by or drive by the Western Reserve Historical Society almost daily. And so I'm glad to be here, even if it's just virtual, among neighbors and friends. And I am really delighted to be able to discuss my book, Black Privilege. So my goal today is first to provide a sort of brief synopsis or overview of the book. So just a taste, a sample of what the book sort of addresses, while also articulating what I believe are the critical contributions and takeaways of the book. So what I hope people learn after reading it. And I also aim to expound on an example of one participant to really illuminate what I believe are core concepts that I introduce in the book. So we'll focus on the story of Tasha to really illuminate core concepts, including the concept of Black privilege. So after our discussion today, I hope that the audience leaves with a more nuanced understanding of the dynamic and complex character of the Black middle class experience. Okay. So before I delve into what the book really aims to accomplish, I think it's important to perhaps describe what my objectives were as a scholar and author. So by focusing on the Black middle class and their consumption, I wanted Black privilege to break away from a tradition which is all too common in sociological research of focusing on Blacks' experiences of suffering and of poverty. So instead, I really wanted to, in my work, show a fuller picture of Black life. And so my aim was really to examine questions of oppression and modern manifestations of racism and the racial order, but also to recognize the tremendous advancements that Blacks have made and acknowledge the fact that Blacks are increasingly becoming situated among the middle class. So, for example, in 1970, only 16% of Blacks had some college, an associate's degree, a bachelor's degree, or higher. By 2008, that number was over 50%. This is an indication of tremendous progress. And I think it is so critical that we begin to examine what does this progress mean and how does it manifest in the lives of middle-class Blacks. So in Black privilege, I examine how this group of economically advantaged Blacks experience privilege. They have credentials that give them access to elite universities, elite institutions, and workplaces. They have capital, they have money in the bag, and they can purchase luxuries. But they still regularly and routinely confront modern forms of racism. So in the book, I introduced the concept of Black privilege to really grapple with this complexity, the complexity that really is the Black middle class experience. And so the concept of Black privilege really attends to this idea that Black people have, or at least middle class Black people have earned an ability to engage in spaces which their class gives them advantages, but that they also experience disadvantages due to their race, right? So how this is manifested often means that they are maintaining a matrix of cultural tastes and preferences that are manifested in their habits and their consumption and their leisure pursuits. And this matrix of tastes and preferences is informed by their racial identity and their racial allegiances, but it's also informed by their class. And so as the book unfolds, I detail how this privilege, Black privilege, is developed and is deployed. So in the work, I really build off of a rich history of scholarship that examines the experiences and worldviews of non-poor Blacks, right? So work that has acknowledged the heterogeneity among Blacks in the United States. So I draw upon a qualitative research design that includes interviews with 54 college-educated Black New Yorkers. And I draw on this data to illustrate how middle-class Blacks engage and display Black privilege in multiple sort of social domains. So where they live, where they work, and also where they play, so sites of leisure. And so from examining the daily lives and lifestyles of these college-educated Blacks, I argue it becomes clear in more ways than one, they are indeed privileged. However, being Black has implications for how they experience the rewards and advantages that their middle class status bestows. So in articulating the concept of Black privilege, I argue it has two core ingredients. So the two core constitutive elements of Black privilege are Black cultural capital and cultural flexibility. So what the heck do I mean by these concepts? So Black cultural capital refers to our cultural tastes, our knowledges, our discernment that are specific to Blacks, right? And this knowledge, this capital, cultural capital, is a resource that helps us to connect in meaningful and mundane ways to other Blacks. So whether you're working in a majority white Wall Street firm or you're attending a Black Baptist church, Black cultural capital enables you to navigate those divergent social settings, right? And it now allows you to maintain a consistent sense of self despite your context. Black cultural capital is often displayed in our aesthetic preferences. So it might be displayed in how we style our hair or the clothes we wear, but it's also displayed and evident in our consumption practices. So where we like to travel to or our leisure activities, as well as the things we buy. So there's a wonderful book that looks at Black art collectors and argues that through collecting Black art, middle-class Blacks are expressing their racial identity. So when we think about what it means to be Black, it's not just a matter of asserting your racial identity. It is something that is performed and displayed through our cultural practices, right? Our cultural practices are what help solidify our membership in the racial group. And so Black cultural capital is critical because it connects us to other Blacks. It is those shared practices that serves as the glue which bonds Blacks to one another. And so for many of my respondents, they talk about how they maintain these stores of Black cultural capital. And it's deeply embedded in their worldviews, in their lifestyles, and it also is informed, it informs their ideological commitments. So for example, most of the respondents I interviewed espoused racial pride, and they also talked about having a desire to engage in racial uplift. And so in many ways, this is an example of how their Black cultural capital was manifested in the ideological commitments that they maintain. So for example, in supporting Black-owned businesses or espousing the belief that it is important to buy Black, that is a demonstration of how Black cultural capital is impacting their decisions and also their consumptions more specifically. So Black cultural capital is a critical element of Black privilege. But the second sort of, or I guess, let me back up. When we think about Black cultural capital, it can be manifested in many different ways. It can be manifested in how we speak. So it can be embodied. It can be manifested in the things that we own. So it could be objectified, and it can also be institutionalized in terms of the organizations and institutions that we are members of. So one example of how Black cultural capital is institutionalized is through attending or being affiliated with historically Black colleges and universities. So on this slide, I have, three very prominent African-American political leaders, and they all share this common experience of being a graduate of an HBCU. So what does that mean? That means that they have this element of connection culturally through these institutional affiliations to other Blacks. And that Black cultural capital helps them gain legitimacy. It helps them to forge ties with other Blacks. And so it is a resource that they can draw upon in various settings, right? So cultural capital is a key element, I argue, of Black privilege, which I argue is increasingly a part of the Black middle class experience. A second core component or critical ingredient of Black privilege is cultural flexibility. And so middle class Blacks who have to regularly cross cultural and racial boundaries, and they often do so quite skillfully, they have to maintain a sense of when to display different types of cultural knowledge. So this means they have to be skillful in determining what type of cultural displays are valued in particular setting. And that skill is what is called cultural flexibility. And this is a critical dimension of Black privilege. So many middle-class Blacks in the study, they espouse a love for the richness of Black culture. And they also realize that they must maintain a diverse repertoire of cultures, right? So, of cultural knowledge bases. So what does that mean? That means that they recognize that while they love being Black and they love Black culture, they also must maintain a familiarity with dominant white culture. That this is also a requisite of being middle class in America today. And so their cultural flexibility in many respects reflects a pragmatic approach of working within a system, working within a society where racism is still very salient, as is anti-Black bias. So they know not in every setting is Black culture valued. So they have to maintain both familiarity with dominant and non-dominant cultural capital. So how does this translate into reality? Well, it's very evident, and in the book I talk about how cultural flexibility is very evident, particularly in the workplace. And so African-American middle-class Blacks, they talk about language and how, they speak on the phone very differently at work as compared to when they're talking to their friends, right? They talk about knowing when to disclose which and what hobbies. So in the book, I talk about an example of an investment banker who also works as a hip hop DJ on the weekends. But he says at work, he does not mention his love of hip hop or his very intimate knowledge of hip hop culture, because that would be stigmatizing. So knowing when to disclose different aspects of one's life, different leisure or hobbies or pursuits, knowing when racialized practices will be devalued is a part of this cultural flexibility. And this was also evident with regarding grooming and hair. And so many middle-class Blacks respondents, particularly those who worked in all-white workplaces or nearly all-white workplaces, talked about how they engaged in a lot of self-presentation management, particularly around their hair. And so for men, this meant getting their hair cut or shape up, once a week so that they always appeared neat and presentable. And for women, this often meant avoiding certain hairstyles, like braids or dreads, or certain natural hairstyles, right? So attempting to appear culturally similar at work as a means of adapting to workplaces where Black culture might not be valued, right? So cultural flexibility was also a sort of key element of middle-class Blacks' lives and a key element of Black privilege, as I have conceptualized it in the book. So to sort of drive home these concepts, I thought it would be useful in the book. And so I want to now talk about one respondent, Tasha, and really to use her story to further illustrate the conceptual relevance of these ideas, of the idea of Black privilege, but also its constitutive elements, Black cultural capital and cultural flexibility. So Tasha was a young attorney, and I would argue she's very much a part of the emerging Black middle class living and working in New York City. And for Tasha, being Black and being middle class were never at odds. And this was very much emblematic of her Black privilege, this sort of intersection of her race and class in many avenues in her life. So when I met Tasha, we actually met at a restaurant that was a sort of Mediterranean and Italian cuisine. And the decor in the restaurant was very modern and sophisticated, and it really hinted at Tasha's taste for the finer things. So once we had settled into a table and ordered our espressos, Tasha made sure to note to me that the restaurant owner was a Black woman. And so her choice really to meet at this upscale, aesthetically pleasing restaurant that was also owned by a Black woman really reflects the fact that her race and her class together shaped her decisions about how and where to spend her money. And so for middle class Blacks like Tasha, who have access to financial resources, and they also have access to cultural knowledge, which together enable them to live a middle class lifestyle, they also do so in ways that are deeply imbued by race. So in this respect, Tasha's consumption preferences, her choice of where to dine, is simultaneously infused by race and also by class. And in many ways in Tasha's life, race and class intersect. So when Tasha, for example, when she leaves Harlem, when she leaves home each morning and heads to work, she goes from an environment where Black culture is celebrated, where she is a part, or she feels she's a part of a Black community, to a setting where she's one of only 2 Black women at her entire company. So she goes from this Black neighborhood to basically an all-white workplace within the course of, the start of her day. And so this change of context requires her to be culturally flexible. It requires cultural maneuvering. So when Tasha is in settings like her workplace, where white culture reigns, her consumption enables her to seamlessly cross those social and cultural boundaries, right? So she's able to display her class status through the suits that she wears, and that enables her to gain entry into her workplace or other sort of all-white settings. And when we look at the experience of this sort of new modern middle-class Black, that is par for the course. So throughout their lives, they are often interacting in settings that diverge dramatically in terms of their race and class composition. And so consumption really becomes a critical tool that enables them to manage moving across and between these settings. And it also helps them manage racial stigma and anti-Black bias, so negative perceptions of Blacks. So when we think about Tasha, in many respects, her Black cultural capital was evident. So she grew up on a cul-de-sac in the suburbs. Her parents were both professionals, but she spent the weekends and the summers in the city with her cousins. And so for Tasha, as for other middle-class Blacks, they often had and were able to draw upon many formative experiences in Black social settings. And they also often maintained routine interactions with other Blacks. So what does that mean? That means that throughout their life, they were engaged in Black social spheres, whether it be hanging out like Tasha with your cousins during the summer, or whether it be accompanying your grandmother to church, or whether it be going to the beauty salon. So these were all critical sites where Blacks were able to develop and cultivate their Black cultural capital. And for Tasha, these were critical sites that enabled her to become familiar with various racialized rites and rituals. There were places where she could learn how to double dutch, or learn how to style her hair, or learn the latest slang. And so through these experiences, Blacks are able to cultivate and develop their Black cultural capital. And this was certainly evident for Tasha. But it was also evident in her choice to attend Spelman. And so Tasha had attended a high school where she was one of few Blacks in her honors classes. So when it came time to choose where to go to college, she chose Spelman. And Spelman, for those who don't know, is a college that was founded to educate Black women in the heart of Black Atlanta. And so Tasha chose to attend a HBCU in part because it was a family tradition. So both of her parents were HBCU grads, but she was also drawn to the South, and she also was drawn to Spelman because she said she wanted to be around, quote, Black people like me, young people who were Black and smart, hardworking, and ambitious. So for Tasha, her choice in where to attend college was also a manifestation of her Black cultural capital. But after attending Spelman, she went on to re-enter, and so to speak, the majority white world by attending Harvard Law, a very prestigious and elite law school, but also one which is majority white. So by attending Spelman and Harvard Law, Tasha was demonstrating another aspect of her Black privilege, her cultural flexibility. And she described attending these different educational institutions as getting the best of both worlds, because she felt by attending both Spelman and Harvard, she was able to reap the rewards of status, pedigree, and racial prestige. So for middle-class Blacks, there are oftentimes instances where they're drawing on their cultural flexibility, and they're drawing on and developing the ability to navigate both Black social worlds and white social worlds. And Tasha, in many respects, was an adroit cultural actor. So she possessed Black cultural capital, but she also possessed a wide range of cultural knowledge that allowed her to gain acceptance in a broader world that values and idealizes dominant culture and mores. So when we think about middle-class Blacks, many are like Tasha. They are regularly and routinely crossing cultural and social boundaries, and so cultural flexibility is critical for them. So I don't want to go over in time, so I want to again highlight the fact that Tasha, by the time she entered the workforce, had a well-developed faculty for engaging in dominant cultural schemas. She had attended all-white schools, she grew up in the suburbs, but she also maintained a desire to represent her race well, and also to be in the company of other Blacks in various sort of settings, whether it be leisure settings or in her neighborhood or among her friends. And so being Black was certainly important, and also she took a great pride in maintaining Black cultural traditions and rituals, right? But she also realized that she couldn't express her deeply felt Black pride in all contexts, right? So when in all white settings where Black culture is not valued, her educational qualifications, having attended one of the most prestigious law schools in the country, was a useful tool. It helped her to gain acceptance in the majority white workplace, where she was certainly a racial token. But Tasha also had the ability to deftly deploy her knowledge of dominant culture. So she was culturally flexible. And so in many respects, Tasha is an example of how Blacks are able to maintain consumptive displays and cultural preferences and practices that are rooted in race, rooted in class, and rooted in the contestation of cultural racism, which is the idea that Blacks are culturally inferior. So Tasha's account, I hope, provides evidence of the concept of Black privilege, which I articulate more deeply in the book. But I think her example also illustrates that there is a new crop of modern middle-class Blacks who aim to be unapologetically Black, but also realize they must be culturally strategic. And so when we look at Black privilege, there are arguably three important takeaways. One is this idea of Black privilege. So the book introduces and defines and examines what it means to be Black and to be privileged. But it also uses consumption as a lens to examine middle-class Blacks' everyday realities. So their everyday realities include the goals of being unapologetically Black, but also the goals of being culturally strategic and of refuting negative stereotypes and social stigma that are attached to Blackness. So these are a part of their everyday lives, and through looking at their consumption, we really can get access to how they are able to navigate these complex dynamics that are part and parcel of their sort of daily experiences. And so this is really the last sort of, I think, also important takeaway, that the book really illustrates that middle-class Blacks are constantly navigating diverse social contexts, which impose different requirements on them, right? And so this means that they have to have unique abilities to draw on and rely on ideas about race pride and knowledge of their the richness of Black culture, while at the same time being able to navigate environments where Black culture isn't valued, and being able to sort of demonstrate in some respects their knowledge of dominant culture. So those, I think, are sort of three rivers that run through the book, three central themes. There are many others, but given my time today, I can't necessarily elaborate them all. But I hope that this has been useful, and a useful, at least initial discussion of some of the key concepts of the book. And lastly, I would just argue that though Blacks are increasingly experiencing privilege in this way, it is certainly still truncated, right? So they're not able to experience all of the benefits that their middle-class status should bestow. They are certainly granted some access, they are granted entry, but not necessarily full inclusion, right? And so I think that also is important to highlight, that, you know, even when everything on paper is perfect, you have all the elite credentials, you have the occupation, that doesn't mean in US society that you will be granted full entry, full inclusion, right? And that is, in many respects, also a sort of goal of the book, to illustrate, even for Blacks who have economic advantage, they still must contend with a system in which racism and anti-Black bias is sort of a core component. So it doesn't buffer them or free them at all from experiencing racism, but it certainly does mean that they have a different, that they experience their lives differently. And therefore it is important to highlight the experience of the Black middle class and not merely focus on the experience of the Black working class or the Black poor, because it's a part of this larger, it's a part of an effort to portray a fuller, larger, more dynamic encapsulation of what it means to be Black in America.